Hi everybody. So far you've looked at how to work with CSS animations and CSS transitions, mostly from a technical level. What does the CSS look like? What does HTML look like? And what are the various things you can do with them? So in this video, we're going to look at both of them together. We're going to look at what makes each of them unique and when you would use a transition versus an animation, or vice versa. So let's get started. So let's first talk about the similarities you have between CSS animations and transitions. And these are all pretty obvious to you, and I'm going to very quickly breeze through them. So first of all, the similarity, they allow you to specify the CSS properties you want to listen for value changes on. That seems like an obvious one. You can specify an easing function so your animations don't have to be very boring. You can actually add things that change the rate, speed up, speed down, bounce, all these things you can specify. You can specify a duration, how long will your animation run. You can also, we haven't gotten to this part yet, but you actually have events in both animation and transitions that allow you to use some JavaScript to control and listen for various things your animation and transitions might be doing. And of course, the last one, our favorite one, you can actually use both of them to modify properties and see what they actually look like as you are going through them. So the real fun part of the video is really looking at the differences. And the point of this is to highlight really some of the things that we might not notice or take for granted. Those are the things that really set them apart, and they will really influence when you want to use one over the other. So first of all, let's talk about starting an animation or starting a CSS transition. If you load a page and you want an animation to run, you probably don't want to use a CSS transition. CSS transitions are really designed to be more reactive. They kick in when you're hovering over an element with the mouse, or when you're giving a text field some focus, or you're writing some JavaScript to programmatically modify your CSS by adding or removing class values, or even setting an inline style directly. Transitions need to be triggered. But animations though, they're very chill. No need to trigger them whatsoever. They are by design created to start running once they are loaded and they are ready to do what they do. So the other big difference is in looping. By default, transitions don't loop. They run once and then they stop. And you can keep triggering them again by using whatever method you used to kick the transition off in the first place, by either mouse hover or the various things I said before, but ultimately they only run just once. Now you can write some code, you can do things to make them loop, and I have some articles on the website on how to do that, but I don't recommend it. It's hackish and it's not really what it was designed to do. No, if you want to have something loop, you want to use a CSS animation. And like I mentioned, they just work. There's nothing you gotta do special for it. You have to do extra work actually to prevent them from looping by making sure the iteration count is set to something like 1 or 0. So this one's kind of obvious. It is defining intermediate points. If you want your animation to do anything but go from point A to point B, you don't want to use a CSS transition. Like we looked at before, and we look at some of the graphs again, a transition can only really do one thing. You have a starting value, you have an ending value, and transition will take care of making sure that the points between them are interpolated. Now, CSS animations, they're different. You have keyframes, you can specify multiple intermediate points, you can tell your animation to do all sorts of things at various stages of the animation as it is running. This graph, you've probably seen it before, but a transition, just point A, point B. An animation, many intermediate points, and the interpolation takes care of the points you didn't define, so you still have an animation, you just have more control over what the animation does at any given time. Okay, now we get to probably one of my favorite differences in what sets animations and transitions apart. And that is how JavaScript friendly they are, or how easily you can write some JavaScript to modify how a transition or an animation behaves. So let's start with the good one. Let's start with the one that is very JavaScript friendly, and that is a CSS transition. Simply how CSS transitions are defined and how the properties work, you can actually use JavaScript very easily to modify how a transition functions. Here's an example. I have a style rule. I have a selector called #myelement, and I need to have a background color that I defined as pure white. And then I have a transition defined where I'm looking for changes in the background color, and if a change is detected, I play an animation that runs for 0.2 seconds, has an easing function applied. Pretty straightforward, nothing else going on there. Now, if I wanted to kick this transition off, all I need is to run some JavaScript that modifies the background color value. And one way I can do that is by simply getting access to the DOM element that's associated with my element, and just setting the background color using an inline declaration directly. In this case, I'm setting the background color to be a dark gray, #333. And when that code runs, the transition that is defined in CSS will kick in. Very beautiful, and there are many cases you'll run into where you'll be doing a combination of defining a transition in CSS and modifying its values in JavaScript. Now, if you're using a CSS animation though, there really isn't a whole lot you can do. You can define the initial animation properties, but that's not really the exciting part. What you really want to do is modify the keyframes and what the animation actually does as it is running. And that is very messy and complicated. Basically, using JavaScript to access the keyframes and make some changes is something I highly don't recommend you do. Like I said, friends don't let friends write JavaScript to alter an animation. And if you want to try it, there's some libraries out there that help you out with it, but I'm pretty sure you're going to find that it is just not worth the effort. Okay, so where does all of this leave us? We saw some similarities and we saw a lot of differences between CSS animations and transitions. So in general, here's what I do when I'm having to choose whether I need to use an animation or a transition. If what I want to do requires the flexibility of having keyframes, those intermediate points, and to make sure they all loop, then I go with an animation. If I'm looking for something really simple, like a simple from or to animation, and more importantly, one that reacts to the user, like a user input, then I go with a transition. And finally, if I want to manipulate the property values that I wish to animate using JavaScript, then I go with a transition as well. And the way I look at it, for the most part, you will almost always use a CSS transition, especially if you're dealing with user interfaces and dealing with user input, because you hover over a button, you want the button's color to change, for example, or you click on a menu item and that menu expands to display a flyout menu. You have all of these cases that are naturally designed and optimized for what a transition would be really great for doing. Now, that doesn't mean that CSS animations don't really have a place in what you're trying to do, outside of like little introductory animations or little videos that you try to create with them. There are a lot of cases where they actually are great. Like if you want to highlight some UI elements, you have a form field that is displaying an error, for example, you might want to glow red. These are great things that an animation is naturally suited for. So for the most part, you pick and choose the one you need to use the most. But if I was a betting man, and I'm really not, but if I had to bet, I would say that you would be using a CSS transition for the bulk of the animation code you end up writing. And with that, if you want to learn more about animation, go to Krupa.com. There are a bunch of courses, a bunch of tutorials that I've written that cover what you've seen here, as well as other topics in much greater detail. If you're stuck or need any help, just post in the forums at forum@Krupa.com, and you can find me all over the place. I'm on Twitter at Krupa, Facebook, and YouTube, all under the name Krupa. Pretty convenient. And of course, if you love the video a lot and you want something more convenient than reading tutorials on the website, there's a book that I wrote called Animation in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And this contains almost 500 pages now of good content on how to do animation-y things in all the stuff you've seen so far. So it's pretty cool. So check it out. It's on Amazon in paperback and Kindle editions. And with that, I will see you guys next time in our next video.